This video is sponsored by CuriosityStream. Hey, welcome to 12 Tone. Over the years, we've talked about lots of really weird and interesting scales. We've even made up some of our own, but let's be honest, not many people are writing music with the enigmatic scale. What if we were to turn that same sort of analytical eye toward the most popular scale in Western music, major? Unsurprisingly, there's been a lot of good research on what makes this scale work, so buckle up, cause we're going deep. Before we do that though, I think it's important to mention that I'm not trying to argue that major is the best scale. I don't even know what that would mean. Major has a lot of great properties that make it work really well as a basic foundational scale, but there's also plenty of properties it doesn't have, and which scale is best will always depend on what you're trying to do with it. My point here is just that major is good, not that any other scale, Western or otherwise, is worse. With that out of the way, let's get started. In order to understand the major scale, we first have to start with the major triad. This is one of the most consonant sounds in Western music, and there's a good reason for that. The frequencies of the three notes in a major triad form a 4 to 5 to 6 ratio, one of the simplest possible. Or, well, this gets a bit messed up thanks to modern tuning, which means what we actually hear is only an approximation of that ratio, but our ears are trained to adjust for that difference, so it still basically works. Anyway, let's take a G major triad with the notes G, B, and D. Now, if we take this top note and build another major triad on top of it, we get D major with D, F sharp, and A. And if we go back down to this starting note and build a major triad below it, we get C major with C, E, and G. And if we take all those notes and rearrange them so they're all in the same octave, we get a G major scale built from 3 overlapping major triads. This is a form of scale building called primary triad construction, and it works because the 1 chord shares a note in common with the 4 chord and with the 5 chord, so all we have to do is pick a root to find the qualities of those 3 chords and we get an entire scale for free. We can do this with any chord qualities we want, but as we saw, if we stick with all major triads, we get the major scale, and since the major triad is such a fundamentally consonant sound, it makes sense that the scale we build out of them would be too. Continuing the consonants theme, it's worth noting that major has a lot of perfect fifths, generally considered the most consonant interval after the octave. If we look at the major scale, it's got 6 of them, the most that a 7-note scale can possibly have. In fact, the only other 7-note scales with that many are the modes, which are a series of scales where you take the notes of the major scale but play them as if a different note is the root. We'll get into those a bit later. Before we do that though, I want to look at a couple more properties that major shares with its modes. For example, it's maximally even. That is, given that our tuning system has 12 distinct pitches, major's as evenly spaced out as a 7-note scale can be. It's not perfectly even because 7 doesn't divide cleanly into 12, so we're forced to slot in some half steps here and there, but they're as far apart as possible, making major the closest we can get to a balanced note distribution. This means we don't get any super weird chords or intervals. It's all as smooth as we can make it. But why 7 notes anyway? Why not use 6 where we can get a perfectly even distribution? Well, lots of reasons, but I think one of the most important is just that we don't really want a perfectly even distribution. Slight variations are what gives the scale its identity. Like, let's take a look at that 6-note distribution. This is called the whole tone scale, and it's completely even. Here we're using G whole tone with these notes, but if we took the F whole tone scale instead, it's the exact same set of notes. Both scales have a G, both have an A, both have a B, and so on. This is because the whole tone scale is symmetrical. Every note is a whole step away from its neighbors, so if we shift everything up or down a whole step, each note just becomes the next one in the scale. This means, in effect, that there are only 2 actual whole tone scales, and the notes themselves give you very little indication as to where the root is. The major scale, on the other hand, is asymmetric. It has no repeating patterns smaller than the octave, which makes it easier to assign and feel the functions of various notes. They all work together to establish the key, giving you a much stronger sense of tonality than the whole tone scale. There's 12 unique major scales, one for each possible root, and while that may seem obvious, it wasn't guaranteed. We only have that because it's asymmetric, and 7 and 5 are the only numbers of notes where the maximally even distribution isn't symmetrical. Well, that's not quite true. There's also 1 note and 11 notes, but let's be real, we were never going to use those. Anyway, that evenness also gives it another cool property. It's heliotonic. This means that you can notate it such that every note in the scale gets its own line or space on the staff. Effectively, the 7 notes of the scale use 7 different letter names. Including this on the list is definitely a bit of a cheat, because modern notation and note names are both effectively built around the major scale, so it shouldn't be surprising that they work so well with it, but I wanted to mention it anyway because heliotonic is fun to say. It's also a proper scale. I made a whole video about this recently, but basically, a scale is proper if the size of its generic intervals are well ordered. That is, if you go up, say, 2 scale steps steps, you will have gone at least as far as if you went up one step somewhere else in the scale. For an example of something that doesn't do that, take the double harmonic scale. Here, the scale step from the 6th to the 7th is 3 half steps wide, whereas going up 2 scale steps from the 7th to the 2nd is only 2 half steps. This presents a contradiction where a larger interval is actually a smaller distance, making the scale improper. There's only a couple proper 7-note scales, so major's in a pretty exclusive club here. But even more exclusive is Myhill's property. This means that every scale step distance corresponds to exactly 2 different half step distances, so like there's major and minor thirds, but no augmented or diminished ones, and major is the only 7-note scale that does this. This may seem like an incredibly arbitrary thing to check for, but it's actually a really big deal for diatonic set theorists. It's like a bellwether. Having Myhill's property guarantees that the scale has all sorts of other cool properties too, including being maximally even. It's also one of only 2 7-note sets with the impressively named deep scale property. I want to make a full video about this at some point, but briefly, this means that each interval occurs a different number of times. There's 1 tritone, 2 half steps, 3 major thirds, 4 minor thirds, 5 whole steps, and 6 perfect fourths. Now, obviously, that's not all the intervals. We already said it has 6 perfect fifths too, which seems to contradict our point, but here's the thing. In scale theory, a perfect fifth actually is a perfect fourth. They're the same thing. Like, G major has the perfect fourth from E to A, which means it also inherently has the perfect fifth from A to E. Including both would mean counting that interval twice, so we usually don't bother with anything larger than a tritone, and thus all of major's intervals are different. This tells us a bunch of cool stuff about like transpositions and whatnot, but that's going to take a whole lot more explaining, so again, follow-up video. Someday. Maybe. We'll see. Having 6 perfect fifths, though, also makes it what's called a well-formed collection, which means we can build it by stacking a single interval over and over. That is, we can start on the 4th, in this case C, and just keep stacking perfect fifths until we get all the notes of the G major scale. This makes the perfect fifth what's called a generator, where we can build the entire scale out of just that one interval, and again, given how consonant the perfect fifth is, being generated by it is kind of a big deal. But isn't it a bit weird that in order to generate it, we started on the 4th? I mean, we get all these other cool properties no matter which note is the root, so why shouldn't it be the note we actually use to generate the scale? If we call that note the root, we get a scale called Lydian, and some theorists have argued that Lydian should be viewed as the fundamental scale in Western music, but I'm not convinced. First of all, we don't actually keep all those cool properties. We lose our primary triad construction. Lydian has a diminished 4 chord, which is a lot less pretty. It still has 3 major triads, and they still include all the notes, but one of them is the 2 chord, which is completely unconnected from the root, so it's not really the same thing. But I think there's a better reason why major is the mode we stuck with. It's based on an argument I first heard from Jacob Collier, and it has to do with resolutions. As we mentioned earlier, every mode of the major scale contains 2 half steps and 1 tritone. These are the 2 most dissonant intervals, so they're the primary drivers of the scale's resolutions, but it can be hard to get the 2 of them to work together. For example, let's look at the major scale. The half steps are here between the 3rd and 4th, and here between the 7th and octave. Each one of these pairs has one unstable note that wants to resolve to the other, and as a rule of thumb, the stable point is going to be whichever one is part of the tonic triad, which is a fancy name for the 1 chord. So in major, the 4th wants to resolve down a half step to the 3rd, the 7th wants to resolve up a half step to the root, and if we take both our unstable notes together, we get a tritone. That's maximum dissonance, creating maximum resolution. Also, notice how the 2 unstable notes resolved in opposite directions? That gives those resolutions a sense of balance, making the scale as a whole feel more stable. On the other hand, if we take Lydian, we still have the 7th rising up to the root, but the 4th is no longer a half step above the 3rd. It's now a half step below the 5th, so it also wants to go up. Both our unstable points resolve in one direction, which means all of the tension in Lydian wants to rise, and if we play the tritone, only one of those notes wants to move. Likewise, if we take the 5th mode, Mixolydian, we get our 4th falling down to the 3rd again, but now the other half step is between the 6th and the 7th. This is a bit trickier because neither of those is in the tonic triad, so as a backup plan, let's say the more stable one is whichever note isn't a tritone away from a note in the 1 chord. In this case, that means the 7th resolves down to the 6th, which means in Mixolydian, all the tension wants to fall. We can run a similar analysis on the other modes and find that only 2 of them have tritones between their unstable points and thus have balanced resolutions. There's major, obviously, and there's the 6th mode, Aeolian, which you might recognize as natural minor, another pretty important scale. Of these two though, major is the only one where that tritone actually resolves to the root, which may help explain why, of all the possible modes, we chose that one as our foundation. And that's just a handful of the cool things about the major scale. Honestly, this video could have been twice as long and I still wouldn't have run out of things to say. Major is such a common device that we don't really stop to think about how cool it actually is, but there's a lot of really good reasons why it makes such a solid foundation for Western music. We've sort of grown out of it a bit, and that's totally fine, but sometimes I think it's worth taking the time to appreciate just how much there is to know about even our most basic musical objects. And if you're looking for a major upgrade to the way you watch documentaries, you might want to check out this video's sponsor, CuriosityStream. See what I did there? I took the name of the scale and yeah, you get it. Anyway, CuriosityStream is a streaming service with a massive library of documentaries to choose from. One that I've been enjoying is Norman Seif's The Sessions. Check it out.
When you say how old I was when I started to play piano, I could say 3 years old maybe, because that's when I didn't know that there was such a thing as separating that, and making different. But if you mean when did I start to be able to distinguish the difference between one note and two notes, probably I was about 4 years old, I guess.
This is actually a series of short clips from photographer Norman Seif where he films the discussions he has with the artists he's photographing, providing a shockingly candid look into these artists' lives and their approach to creativity. It features some amazing musicians including Herbie Hancock, Ray Charles, Nate Ruess, and Stevie Nicks, as well as other brilliant creative minds like Jim Henson. There's a lot of gems in this series. And there's plenty more where that came from, including documentaries on the arts, history, science, and nature. They're even offering 12-Tone viewers a free 30-day membership to get you started, so just click the link in the description, use the promo code 12-Tone when signing up, and enjoy their entire library for free. And hey, thanks for watching, thanks to our Patreon patrons for making these videos possible, and extra special thanks to this video's featured patron, Owen Campbell Moore. If you want to help out and get some sweet perks like sneak peeks of upcoming episodes, there's a link to our Patreon on screen now. You can also join our mailing list to find out about new episodes, like, share, comment, subscribe, and above all, keep on rockin'.